A flight attendant serves a millionaire on a private jet, but his reaction changes her life for two. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The smell of recycled air and expensive cologne filled the cabin of the Gulfstream G650 as Jane Harris smoothed her navy uniform skirt and checked her watch. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, she'd learned to find peace in the routine. Serve, smile, survive another day. The private jet hummed with quiet efficiency, carrying its single passenger from London back to New York, and Jane moved through her pre-landing checklist with practiced precision. She'd been working charter flights for Prestige Aviation for 3 years now, long enough to recognize the type of man slouched in seat 2A without even looking at the passenger manifest. Stephen Green, tech mogul, Forbes list regular. The kind of wealth that bought silence and commanded fear in equal measure. Jane had researched him during the brief layover in London, not out of curiosity, but necessity. The ultra-wealthy passengers required different handling. They expected their coffee at exact temperatures, their newspapers pressed flat, their privacy absolute. Stephen Green's file was thicker than most, filled with warnings from previous cabin crews. Demanding, impossible, cold as winter in Chicago. But rent was due in 6 days, and her mother's latest medical bills sat unopened on her kitchen counter back in Queens. Jane needed this job, needed the overtime pay that came with difficult passengers, needed every penny that could buy her another month of keeping her small world from falling apart. She glanced toward the front of the cabin where Stephen sat hunched over a stack of papers, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he scribbled notes in margins. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he read something that displeased him. He'd barely acknowledged her presence during boarding, offering only a curt nod when she'd attempted her standard safety briefing. "Mr. Green," Jane kept her voice soft, professional. "We'll be beginning our descent into JFK in about 20 minutes. Can I offer you anything before we land?" He looked up, and for a moment, Jane felt the full weight of his attention. His eyes were darker than she'd expected, almost black in the cabin's muted lighting, and they seemed to catalogue everything about her in a single sweep. Her carefully styled blonde hair, her regulation lipstick, the small coffee stain on her left sleeve from the morning's rush. "Coffee," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Black, and I need absolute quiet until we touch down. This—" He gestured to the papers spread across his table. "Can't wait." Jane nodded, already moving toward the galley. Through the small window, she could see the lights of the East Coast beginning to twinkle below them, a constellation of ambition and broken dreams. In a few hours, she'd be back in her studio apartment, counting tips and calculating how many more flights she needed before she could finally quit this job and open the small bookstore she'd been dreaming about since college. The coffee maker hummed to life, filling the galley with the rich scent of expensive Colombian beans. Prestige Aviation spared no expense, even on the details their passengers would never notice. Jane had learned to appreciate these small luxuries: the Egyptian cotton towels, the hand-selected coffee, the crystal glasses that caught the light like captured stars. She was just reaching for the bone china cup when the plane lurched. Not the gentle dip of routine turbulence, but a violent drop that sent her stomach into her throat and her feet sliding across the galley floor. The coffee maker groaned, the pot tilting dangerously as the aircraft bucked like an angry horse. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We've hit some unexpected clear air turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we navigate through this system." Jane grabbed the counter, steadying herself as another jolt rocked the cabin. The coffee pot slid toward the edge of the burner, and she lunged forward to catch it, her body weight shifting with the plane's erratic movement. The cup in her other hand went flying. Time seemed to slow as Jane watched the bone china arc through the air, coffee streaming behind it like a dark comet. She could see Stephen Green looking up from his papers, could see the exact moment his expression changed from mild annoyance to something far more dangerous. The cup shattered against his table with a sound like breaking promises, and the hot coffee spread across his documents in an unstoppable tide of brown destruction. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the steady hum of the engines and Jane's own ragged breathing. Stephen stared down at the ruined papers, coffee dripping from the table onto his perfectly pressed charcoal suit, and Jane felt her world tilt on its axis. Those weren't just any documents. Even from where she stood frozen in the galley doorway, she could see the letterhead, the official seals, the kind of dense legal text that meant millions of dollars and years of negotiation. Mr. Green, I'm so sorry." Jane started forward, her hands already reaching for the cloth napkins, but Stephen's voice cut through her apology like a blade. "Don't." The word was quiet, controlled, more terrifying than if he'd shouted, "And don't touch anything." He stood slowly, coffee still dripping from his jacket, and Jane saw something shift in his expression, a calculation she didn't understand, but instinctively feared. When he looked at her again, his dark eyes held a coldness that made the air in the cabin feel thin. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Jane's mouth felt dry as cotton. "I can help you dry them off. Maybe they're still readable." "These documents," Stephen said, his voice deadly calm, "were the only signed copies of a merger agreement worth $400 million. The signing was scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He checked his watch. 14 hours. The number hit Jane like a physical blow. 400 million. More money than she could conceptualize, more than her entire Queens neighborhood was worth, more than she would earn in a dozen lifetimes. "I can explain to your lawyers, to whoever needs to know, it was an accident. The turbulence," Stephen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "An accident." "Yes, I'm sure that's exactly what the board of directors will want to hear when the deal falls through, because their copies are illegible." He moved closer, and Jane caught a whiff of his cologne mixed with the bitter scent of spilled coffee. Everything about him radiated control, from the perfect knot of his tie to the way he held his shoulders. But she could see something else underneath, a kind of fury that ran deeper than this moment, older than this mistake. "Oh, what's your name?" he asked. Jane Harris?" "Well, Jane Harris, you've just cost me more money than you'll earn in your entire life." Stephen pulled out his phone, his thumb moving over the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm calling my legal team now. They'll need your employment records, your financial information, everything." "My financial information?" Jane's voice cracked. "I don't understand." Stephen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're going to understand very quickly. When someone causes this level of damage, there are consequences, legal consequences." The plane dipped again, gentler this time, as they continued their descent toward New York. Through the windows, Jane could see the city spreading out below them, millions of lights that suddenly looked less like opportunities and more like a vast, indifferent universe that didn't care about one flight attendant's mistake. "Mr. Green, please." "I have insurance through the airline. There has to be some way. Your airline's insurance doesn't cover intentional sabotage." "Sabotage?" Jane's voice rose an octave. "You can't be serious. It was turbulence. You saw it happen." Stephen was already on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Jane caught fragments: potential corporate espionage, immediate investigation, full damages, words that made her stomach clench with growing panic. When he ended the call, Stephen looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Sit down," Jane Harris. We need to talk." Jane remained standing, her back pressed against the galley counter. "I'm not sitting down. I'm not doing anything until you explain what you meant by sabotage." Corporate espionage is more common than you might think in my line of work. A convenient accident at exactly the right moment. A destroyed document that could cost millions. It's happened before. That's insane. I don't even know what your company does. Green Tech Solutions. We specialize in renewable energy infrastructure. The merger you just sabotaged would have created the largest solar energy consortium on the East Coast. Stephen's voice carried a note of something that might have been disappointment. "But I'm sure you already knew that." Jane felt like she was drowning in absurdity. "I knew nothing. I researched you because that's my job. Learn about passengers, make sure they're comfortable. I read that you own tech companies. I don't know anything about solar energy or mergers or—" She gestured helplessly at the coffee-stained papers. "Any of this." "Then you won't mind submitting to a full background check. Phone records, bank statements, recent contacts." Stephen was watching her face carefully, as if her expression might reveal secrets she didn't know she was keeping. "This is crazy," Jane laughed, but it came out sounding strangled. "Oh, you're talking about investigating me because I spilled coffee, because of turbulence. I'm talking about protecting my interests, something you clearly don't understand." The plane began its final approach, the engine noise changing pitch as they descended toward JFK. In a few minutes, they'd be on the ground, and Jane would be stepping into a nightmare she couldn't have imagined when she'd started her shift that morning. Listen," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I understand you're upset. I understand this is a big deal, but I'm just a flight attendant trying to pay my bills. I'm not some corporate spy. I don't have bank accounts full of mysterious money. I don't have connections to your competitors. I live in a studio apartment in Queens and eat ramen noodles 4 nights a week because that's what I can afford." Something flickered across Stephen's face, too quick to interpret. "If that's true, then you won't have any problem proving it." "And if I refuse?" Stephen's smile was cold and sharp. "Then my lawyers will be very interested in discussing that choice with you, along with the district attorney's office." The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud that Jane felt in her bones. Below them, New York City spread out like a circuit board, all lights and intersections and millions of people going about their lives, unaware that one woman's world was about to shatter. "There is one alternative," Stephen said, his voice casual in a way that immediately put Jane on guard. "What alternative?" "You work for me." Jane blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "1 year. You become my personal assistant, full-time, exclusive employment. You help me rebuild what you destroyed, and at the end of the year, we'll call it even." "That's insane. I already have a job." "Not after tonight, you don't. I can guarantee Prestige Aviation will terminate your employment the moment I file my complaint." Stephen leaned back in his seat, seemingly unconcerned by the coffee stains on his expensive suit. "No, but working for me, you'd make more in a year than you'd earn in 5 years as a flight attendant, enough to pay off whatever debts are keeping you awake at night." Jane's breath caught. How could he possibly know about her debts? "I can see it in your eyes," Stephen continued. "The desperation, the exhaustion. You're working this job because you need the money, not because you love serving coffee to entitled rich men. So here's my offer. Serve just one entitled rich man for a year, make enough money to solve your problems, and walk away debt-free." The plane touched down with a slight bump, the reverse thrust of the engines filling the cabin with familiar noise. Jane gripped the galley counter as the aircraft rolled toward the terminal, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same impossible choice. And if I refuse, then you'll spend the next several years in and out of courtrooms, watching your legal bills pile up while my lawyers systematically destroy your life. They're very good at their jobs, Jane. Very thorough." The plane came to a complete stop, and Jane heard the engines winding down. In a few minutes, the ground crew would connect the jet bridge, and she would have to walk off this plane and into whatever came next. I need time to think about this. You have until we reach the gate. Stephen was already gathering the undamaged papers from his table, his movements efficient and controlled. My car will be waiting. You can ride with me to my office and we'll discuss the details of your employment, or you can call a taxi and wait for the legal papers to arrive at your apartment. Your choice. Jane closed her eyes, trying to think through the impossible mathematics of her situation. Her mother's medical bills, her own student loans, the rent that was due in 6 days, the dream of a bookstore that seemed to move further away with every passing month. Opening her eyes, she looked at Stephen Green. Really looked at him. Despite the coffee stains, despite the destroyed documents, despite the veiled threats, he didn't look like a man who was out of control. He looked like someone who was used to solving problems, used to turning disasters into opportunities. What would I be doing as your assistant? Managing my schedule, handling correspondence, organizing my life. Stephen's voice took on a note of something that might have been amusement. Apparently, you have a talent for chaos. I'd like to see if you're equally talented at creating order. The jet bridge connected with a soft thud, and Jane heard voices outside, ground crew, airport personnel, the ordinary sounds of people doing ordinary jobs. People who weren't being blackmailed by millionaires or facing lawsuits that could destroy their lives. Full-time means what, exactly? Available when I need you, which is most of the time. Stephen stood, towering over her in the narrow galley space. I work long hours, Jane. I travel frequently. I have very high standards and very little patience for incompetence. And at the end of the year, you'll have enough money to buy your little bookstore and never think about Stephen Green again. Jane's heart skipped. How did you? I told you, I'm very thorough when I investigate people. Your internet search history makes for interesting reading. Bookstore business plans, commercial real estate listings, small business loan applications you never submitted. Stephen moved toward the cabin door, pausing to look back at her. And the question is whether you're brave enough to take a shortcut to your dreams, or if you'd rather spend the next decade serving coffee and hoping for a miracle. The cabin door opened, letting in the sounds and smells of JFK Airport, jet fuel and floor cleaner, and the distant hum of a city that never stopped moving. Jane could see Stephen's driver waiting at the end of the jet bridge, a professional-looking man in a dark suit who probably earned more in a month than she did in 3. I'll do it, Jane heard herself say, the words coming out before her rational mind could stop them. 1 year, but I want the terms in writing, a real contract, not just your word. Stephen's smile was different this time, still sharp, but with something that might have been approval. Well, I wouldn't expect anything less. My lawyers will have the paperwork ready within the hour. As they walked off the plane together, Jane caught a glimpse of her reflection in the terminal windows. A woman in a rumpled uniform walking beside a man who could probably buy and sell everything she'd ever known. She looked small next to him, insignificant, but there was something in her expression that she'd never seen before. It might have been fear. It might have been determination. It might have been the first sign that Jane Harris was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when her back was against the wall. The car ride into Manhattan passed in tense silence, the city lights streaming past the windows like fallen stars. Jane sat as far from Stephen as the luxury sedan would allow, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just agreed to. 1 year of her life. 1 year of serving a man who'd just threatened to destroy her over spilled coffee. 1 year of whatever high standards and very little patience meant in Stephen Green's world, but also 1 year that could change everything. 1 year that could buy her freedom, her dreams, her mother's health, and a future she'd never dared to believe was possible. As the car pulled up to a gleaming office tower in Midtown, Jane caught Stephen watching her in the reflection of the window. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if he was having second thoughts about this arrangement. Too late now, she thought as the driver opened her door, for both of us. The elevator to the 37th floor of the Green Tech Solutions building was the kind of elevator Jane had only seen in movies. All gleaming brass and mirrors that reflected her increasingly uncertain expression back at her from multiple angles. Stephen stood beside her, checking his phone with the kind of focused intensity that suggested the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "It's almost midnight," Jane said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the airport. "Don't your lawyers have families, lives?" Stephen glanced up from his screen. "My lawyers have contracts that include availability clauses. When I need them, they come. It's a simple arrangement, like the one you're forcing on me." "The one you agreed to," Stephen corrected, his voice carrying a hint of steel. "No one forced you to do anything, Jane. You made a choice." The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that looked like something from an architectural magazine. All clean lines and expensive furniture arranged with mathematical precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Manhattan that probably cost more per square foot than Jane's entire apartment. "Impressive," she said, despite herself. "It serves its purpose." Stephen's tone was matter-of-fact, as if commanding a view of the most powerful city in the world was just another business expense. "This way." They walked through a maze of empty cubicles and corner offices, past conference rooms with glass walls and technology that Jane couldn't begin to identify. Even at midnight, the building hummed with quiet energy. Servers running, security systems monitoring, the subtle sounds of an empire that never truly slept. Stephen's office occupied the entire corner of the building, with windows on 2 sides that offered a panoramic view of the city below. The space was larger than Jane's apartment, furnished with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Stephen said, gesturing to a cluster of leather chairs arranged around a coffee table that probably cost more than Jane's monthly rent. "I'm not comfortable," Jane replied, but she sat anyway, sinking into leather so soft it felt like being embraced by expensive clouds. Stephen loosened his tie, the first sign she'd seen that he was human rather than some perfectly calibrated business machine. The coffee stains on his shirt had dried to an ugly brown, and Jane felt a fresh wave of guilt about the documents that had started this entire nightmare. "The lawyers will be here in 10 minutes, Stephen said, settling into the chair across from her. "While we wait, you should understand what you're agreeing to. I thought I was agreeing to be your assistant for a year." "You are. But being my assistant isn't like working for anyone else." Stephen leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made Jane want to look away. "I don't have normal business hours. I don't take vacations. I don't make small talk or worry about your feelings when I need something done." "Sounds delightful. I'm serious, Jane. This isn't a game. I built this company from nothing, and I protect it like—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "And I protect it completely. That means everyone who works for me, everyone who has access to my life, my business, my information, becomes part of that protection." "You mean they become part of your control?" Stephen's smile was sharp as a blade. "Same thing." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city below. Jane found herself studying Stephen's face, trying to read the man behind the corporate armor. There were lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he'd shown her, but also a tightness to his jaw that spoke of constant tension. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. If you need an assistant, you could hire anyone. Someone with experience, someone with an MBA, someone who hasn't just destroyed your important documents. Because someone with an MBA would have expectations. They'd want career advancement, networking opportunities, a future with the company. Stephen's voice was matter of fact. You just want to survive the year and get out. That makes you perfect for what I need. Which is what, exactly? Someone who won't try to manage me. Someone who won't think they know better than I do about how to run my life or my business. Someone who will do exactly what I tell them to do, when I tell them to do it, without asking questions or offering suggestions. Jane felt a flicker of something that might have been anger. You want a robot. I want competence without ambition, loyalty without agenda. Stephen checked his watch. And based on what I've learned about your financial situation, you want money without having to pretend you care about renewable energy or corporate synergy or any of the other things that motivate people in my industry. Before Jane could respond, there was a soft knock at the office door. Stephen called out, and 3 people entered, 2 men and a woman, all carrying briefcases and wearing the kind of expensive, conservative clothing that screamed legal representation. Mr. Green, the older of the 2 men said, nodding respectfully, we have the employment contract ready for your review. Jane Harris, Stephen said, gesturing in her direction, meet Crawford, Phillips, and Martinez. They'll be handling the legal aspects of our arrangement. The woman, Martinez, Jane assumed, smiled with professional warmth. Ms. Harris, we understand you've agreed to a 1-year employment contract with Mr. Green. We've prepared a comprehensive agreement that protects both parties' interests. Mostly his interests, I'm guessing, Jane said. The contract is extremely generous, Crawford said, opening his briefcase and extracting a thick stack of papers. The salary alone is well above market rate for executive assistant positions. He handed Jane the contract, and she felt her breath catch when she saw the salary figure. It was more than generous. It was life-changing, enough to pay off her mother's medical bills, her student loans, her credit cards, and still have money left over to put a down payment on a small business. This can't be right, she said, looking up at Stephen. This is too much money. It's exactly what the position is worth, Stephen replied. You'll be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You'll travel when I travel, work when I work, and be available whenever I need you. That level of availability commands a premium. Jane read through the first few pages of the contract. Her legal knowledge limited but sufficient to understand the basic terms. 1 year of exclusive employment. Confidentiality agreements that seemed to cover everything short of her own thoughts. Termination clauses that heavily favored Stephen's interests, but included enough protection for her to feel reasonably secure. What about my apartment? My life in Queens? You'll be living in company housing, Martinez said smoothly. A fully furnished apartment in Manhattan, walking distance from the office. All expenses paid, of course. I don't want to give up my apartment. You're not giving it up, Stephen said. Consider it a sabbatical. At the end of the year, you can go back to your old life or start a new one. Your choice. Jane flipped through more pages, her head spinning with legal language and financial figures that seemed too good to be true. There has to be a catch. The catch, Phillips said, is that this is an exclusive arrangement. For the duration of the contract, you work only for Mr. Green. No outside employment, no consulting, no freelance work of any kind. And if I breach the contract? Significant financial penalties, Crawford said, but also significant financial rewards for completion. There's a completion bonus equal to 6 months' salary if you fulfill the entire term of the agreement. Jane did the mental math and felt dizzy. The completion bonus alone would be enough to open her bookstore, fully stocked and ready for business. I need a lawyer of my own to review this. Of course, Stephen said. Martinez can recommend someone if you don't have representation. Actually, Martinez said, we've taken the liberty of having the contract reviewed by an independent attorney, someone with no connection to Mr. Green or his companies. She's prepared a summary of the terms from your perspective, highlighting both the benefits and the potential risks. She handed Jane a second, much thinner document. Jane scanned it quickly, noting the independent lawyer's assessment. Extremely favorable terms for the employee, with unusual but not unreasonable restrictions. The biggest risk identified was the subjective nature of performance evaluation. Stephen would have significant discretion in determining whether Jane was meeting the contract's terms. What happens if you decide I'm not doing a good job? Then we'll discuss the specific issues and find ways to address them, Stephen said. I'm not interested in setting you up for failure, Jane. Your success in this position is directly tied to my success in running my business. And if we just can't work together, if we hate each other, Stephen's expression didn't change. Then we'll hate each other professionally for 11 more months after we figure that out. Jane looked around the room, at the lawyers with their expensive suits and briefcases, at Stephen with his coffee-stained shirt and unreadable eyes, at the contract that could solve every financial problem she'd ever had. 6 hours ago, she'd been a flight attendant serving coffee and dreaming about someday, maybe, opening a small bookstore. Now she was sitting in a corner office overlooking Manhattan, holding a contract that could make those dreams a reality in 12 months instead of 12 years. I'll need the weekend to think about it, she said. You have until tomorrow morning, Stephen replied. I start work at 6:30. If you're going to do this, you need to be ready to start immediately. That's less than 7 hours. It's more than enough time to make a decision. You either want this opportunity or you don't. Jane stood up, still holding the contract. And if I decide I don't want it, Stephen's smile was thin, then my lawyers will file suit against you for the damages you caused tonight. The coffee-stained documents, the failed merger, the lost revenue, it all adds up to approximately $23 million in actual damages. The number hit Jane like a physical blow. And $23 million, plus legal fees and punitive damages. Conservatively, you'd be looking at a judgment of around $30 million. I don't have $30 million. I don't have $30,000. I know. Which would make the judgment essentially a life sentence of debt, garnished wages, seized assets, bankruptcy that follows you forever. Stephen's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. Of course, if you're working for me, earning a substantial salary, that changes the calculation significantly. Jane felt the walls of the office closing in around her. So, my choices are work for you or be destroyed financially. Your choices are take responsibility for the damage you caused or spend the rest of your life running from the consequences. Stephen stood, moving to the window that looked out over the city. And I'm offering you a way to take responsibility that also happens to benefit you enormously. Most people would call that generous. Most people would call that coercion. Most people have never lost $23 million to spilled coffee. Jane looked down at the contract again, at the salary figure that seemed to glow on the page like a promise. 1 year. 12 months of her life in exchange for financial freedom and the chance to build the future she'd always wanted. I'll need to call my mother. Tell her what's happening. Of course. There's a private office down the hall you can use. As Jane walked toward the door, Stephen's voice stopped her. Jane? She turned back to face him. For what it's worth, I think you'll be good at this job. You're smart, you're observant, and you're not easily intimidated. Those are valuable qualities in my world. Are you trying to make me feel better about being blackmailed? Stephen's laugh was unexpected, genuine and warm in a way that transformed his entire face. For a moment, Jane caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before whatever had happened to make him so ruthlessly controlled. "I'm trying to make you understand that this arrangement benefits both of us. You get financial security and a chance at your dreams. I get someone competent who isn't trying to climb a corporate ladder or position themselves for a promotion. And after the year is over, you'll never have to see me again." Stephen's expression grew serious again. "Unless you want to." Jane left him standing by the window, silhouetted against the lights of Manhattan, and went to make a phone call that would change everything about the life she thought she was going to live. 27 hours later, Jane stood in the marble lobby of Stephen Green's office building, wearing a black suit she'd bought with money she couldn't afford and carrying a briefcase that contained her entire life reorganized into portable form. The contract was signed. Her apartment was sublet. Her mother was concerned but cautiously supportive. And Jane Harris, former flight attendant and future bookstore owner, was about to become the personal assistant to one of the most powerful men in New York City. The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt different this time, less like ascending to judgment and more like climbing toward an uncertain but potentially transformative future. When the doors opened, Jane saw Stephen waiting for her, dressed in a perfectly pressed charcoal suit that showed no evidence of yesterday's coffee disaster. "Punctual," he said, checking his watch. "Good. We have a full schedule today." "Good morning to you too," Jane replied, stepping out of the elevator. Stephen's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Good morning, Jane. Welcome to Green Tech Solutions. Are you ready to get started?" Jane looked around the reception area, at the expensive furniture and commanding views, at the man who had just become her employer and, in some ways, her captor. She thought about the bookstore that was now 12 months away instead of 12 years, about her mother's medical bills that would finally be paid, about the leap of faith she was about to take into a world she didn't understand. "I'm ready," she said, and discovered that she meant it. 3 weeks into her new life, Jane had learned that Stephen Green operated on what she privately called billionaire time, a reality where 6:30 a.m. meetings were normal, where lunch was often forgotten entirely, and where the concept of weekends was more theoretical than practical. She'd also learned that he took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar cube, that he read 3 newspapers every morning in a specific order, and that he had an uncanny ability to remember every detail of every conversation he'd ever had. What she hadn't learned was how to stop noticing the way his forehead creased when he was concentrating, or how his voice softened almost imperceptibly when he was talking to his elderly secretary about her grandchildren. The Morrison account files are on your desk," Jane said, setting Stephen's morning coffee beside his computer with practiced precision. "The Yamamoto meeting has been moved to 2:30 to accommodate the Tokyo time difference, and your sister called 3 times, asking why you haven't returned her calls." Stephen looked up from his computer screen, and Jane caught a flash of something that might have been surprise. "Rebecca called you directly," she said, and I quote, "If my stubborn brother won't answer his phone, maybe his assistant will have better sense." Jane consulted her tablet. She also mentioned something about Sunday dinner and how Mom is planning to disown you if you miss another one. "My family has a flair for melodrama. Your family sounds normal, which, based on what I've observed about your social life, must be terrifying for you." Stephen's mouth quirked upward. Over the past 3 weeks, Jane had discovered that he had a sense of humor buried somewhere beneath the corporate armor, dry, unexpected, and surprisingly self-aware. "My social life serves its purpose." Which is what, exactly? Because, from where I sit, your social life consists of business dinners, charity galas where you write checks and leave early, and an impressive collection of women who call here asking for you and hang up when I tell them you're unavailable. You've been keeping track of my phone calls. I've been doing my job, which includes protecting you from distractions." Jane moved to the window, adjusting the blinds to reduce glare on Stephen's computer screen. Though I have to say, some of those distractions sound very disappointed when I explain that you're not available. I'm never available for personal calls during business hours. You're never available for personal calls during any hours. When was the last time you had an actual conversation with someone that wasn't about renewable energy or market projections? Stephen saved his document and leaned back in his chair, studying Jane with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Are you psychoanalyzing me, Miss Harris? I'm observing that your emotional life appears to be as carefully managed as your business schedule, which seems exhausting." "What I find exhausting," Stephen said, standing and moving to the credenza where he kept his backup coffee supplies, "is people who think they understand my life based on 3 weeks of managing my calendar." Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You're right. I apologize. Your personal life is none of my business." "No, it's not." Stephen's voice was cooler now, the brief moment of warmth evaporating like steam. "Your business is keeping my professional life running smoothly, which reminds me, I need you to cancel my dinner with Victoria Chen tonight. The venture capitalist. That's the 3rd time you've rescheduled with her." "Ms. Chen will understand." Jane made a note on her tablet, then looked up at Stephen with carefully neutral expression. "Should I reschedule? Or are you permanently avoiding one of the most influential investors on the West Coast?" "I'm not avoiding anyone. I'm prioritizing." "Right. Just like you prioritized missing your nephew's birthday party last weekend and the gallery opening your college roommate invited you to, and coffee with that entrepreneur who flew in from Seattle specifically to meet with you." Stephen turned to face her fully, and Jane saw something shift in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that suggested she'd touched a nerve. "My priorities are what built this company, Jane. They're what pay your salary and fund the research that might actually make a difference in the world. If you find my social habits lacking, you're welcome to review your contract and remind yourself what you're being paid to do." The words hit Jane like a slap, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm being paid to make your life run more efficiently. And from my perspective, burning bridges with important people because you can't manage to show up for dinner isn't particularly efficient." "You think I can't manage to show up?" "I think you choose not to show up. There's a difference." The silence stretched between them, charged with a tension that Jane didn't fully understand. Stephen moved closer to his desk, and she caught a whiff of his cologne, something expensive and subtle that she'd begun to associate with the particular kind of pressure that came from working in close proximity to someone who commanded attention without trying. "You want to know why I cancelled dinner with Victoria Chen?" Stephen's voice was quietly dangerous. Because the last time I had dinner with an attractive, intelligent woman who wanted to discuss business, I ended up losing $40 million and learning that my fiancé had been passing information to my competitors for 6 months." Jane felt her breath catch. "Stephen, so forgive me if I prefer to keep my professional relationships professional and my personal relationships non-existent. It's served me well so far." He sat back down at his computer, effectively dismissing her, but Jane remained standing by the window. The morning light cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the way his shoulders held themselves rigid against some invisible weight. "What was her name?" Jane asked quietly. "Oh, it doesn't matter. It matters enough that you're still letting her control your decisions 3 years later." Stephen's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. 2 years, and I'm not letting anyone control anything." "No. Then why are you afraid to have dinner with Victoria Chen?" "I'm not afraid of anything." Prove it." Stephen looked up at her then, his dark eyes holding a challenge that Jane felt in her chest like a physical thing. What exactly are you suggesting? Have dinner with Victoria Chen. Hell, have dinner with anyone who isn't a business associate or a family member who guilt-trips you into showing up. Jane moved closer to his desk, her tablet clutched against her chest like armor. "Just show me that Stephen Green isn't afraid of his own shadow. And if I refuse, then I'll know that the man who threatened to sue me for $23 million over spilled coffee is actually terrified of meaningful human connection." Stephen stood up slowly, his full height making Jane suddenly aware of how small the office felt when he was angry. "You're out of line. I'm being honest. Which, according to your own rules, is what you pay me for. I pay you to manage my schedule, not my psychology. Sometimes they're the same thing." Stephen moved around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that Jane could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You want me to prove I'm not afraid of dinner with Victoria Chen? I want you to prove you're not afraid of dinner with anyone." "Fine." Stephen's voice was soft, controlled, absolutely lethal. "You're right. I should have dinner with someone who isn't a business associate or family member." "Good. I'll call Victoria. I'll have dinner with you." Jane's tablet slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor between them. "What?" "Tonight. 8 o'clock. Somewhere public, somewhere professional, somewhere that proves I'm perfectly capable of having a normal conversation with an intelligent woman without letting my past dictate my present." "That's not what I meant." "But it's what you suggested. Dinner with someone who isn't a business associate or family member." Stephen's smile was sharp as a blade. "And unless you're afraid that you can't handle a simple dinner without it becoming complicated." Jane felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "I work for you. That makes me a business associate. You work for me because I forced you to work for me. That makes you something else entirely." The air between them seemed charged with electricity, heavy with implications that Jane didn't want to examine too closely. Stephen was standing close enough that she could see the way his pulse beat at the base of his throat, could smell the faint scent of his aftershave mixing with something darker, more complicated. "This is a bad idea," she said. "Probably. But you're the one who issued the challenge." Jane bent to retrieve her tablet, using the moment to compose herself and put some distance between them. When she straightened, Stephen was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "One dinner," she said. "Somewhere public, strictly professional." "Strictly professional," Stephen agreed. "I'll pick you up at 8. I can meet you there." "I'll pick you up at 8, Stephen repeated, his tone making it clear that this wasn't negotiable. Jane nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As she moved toward the door, Stephen's voice stopped her. "Oh, Jane." She turned back. "Wear something nice. If we're going to prove that I can have dinner with an intelligent woman, we might as well do it properly." The company apartment Stephen had provided was everything Jane's studio in Queens wasn't: spacious, elegantly furnished, and located in a building where the doorman knew her name and the elevators never smelled like someone's leftover takeout. It was also completely impersonal, decorated in shades of beige and cream that suggested expensive taste and zero emotional investment. Jane stood in front of the walk-in closet, staring at clothes she'd bought with her new salary and wondering what constituted something nice for dinner with a billionaire who'd blackmailed her into employment. The conservative suits she wore to work felt too formal, but the few casual dresses she owned seemed too intimate for whatever strange game she and Stephen were playing. She settled on a navy blue dress that fell just below her knees, professional enough to maintain boundaries, but feminine enough to meet Stephen's definition of nice. As she applied lipstick in the bathroom mirror, Jane caught sight of her own eyes and was startled by what she saw there. She looked nervous. But underneath the nerves was something else. Anticipation, excitement, the kind of energy that came from standing on the edge of something that might be wonderful or might be disastrous. "It's just dinner," she told her reflection. "A professional dinner between a boss and his employee, nothing more." But even as she said the words, Jane knew she was lying to herself. The intercom buzzed at exactly 8 o'clock, and Jane felt her stomach flip as she grabbed her purse and headed for the elevator. Stephen was waiting in the lobby, leaning against the marble reception desk with the kind of casual elegance that came from a lifetime of expensive clothes and absolute confidence. He changed out of his business suit into dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made his shoulders look broader and his eyes look almost black. When he saw Jane stepping out of the elevator, something shifted in his expression. Surprise, appreciation, something warmer than she'd seen from him before. "You look beautiful," he said, and Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you. You look—" She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't reveal how the sight of him in casual clothes was affecting her breathing. Different? Different good? Or different concerning? Just different. Stephen's car was waiting outside, not the corporate sedan with driver that Jane was used to, but a sleek BMW that he drove himself. As they pulled into Manhattan traffic, Jane found herself studying his profile in the dashboard lights, noticing details she'd never allowed herself to observe in the office. The way his hands looked on the steering wheel, confident and careful. The small scar on his chin that she'd never noticed before. The fact that he listened to jazz music when he wasn't thinking about business. Something soft and complicated that filled the car with unexpected intimacy. "Where are we going?" she asked, needing to break the silence that felt too comfortable. A place in Soho, small, quiet, good food. Stephen glanced at her as they stopped at a red light. Somewhere we can have a conversation without being interrupted by people wanting to discuss solar panel efficiency. Do you get interrupted often? More than you'd think. The renewable energy world is smaller than most people realize. The restaurant Stephen chose was everything he'd promised, intimate without being romantic, upscale without being intimidating. The hostess recognized him and led them to a corner table that offered privacy without isolation. "Wine?" Stephen asked, scanning the menu. "I probably shouldn't. I still have work to finish tonight." "Jane, you're having dinner with your boss. Consider it a business meeting that requires lubrication." That might be the most honest thing you've ever said about our working relationship. Stephen laughed, genuine and warm, and Jane felt something shift between them. Away from the office, without the structure of employer and employee defining every interaction, they felt like two people discovering they actually enjoyed each other's company. "Tell me about the bookstore," Stephen said after they'd ordered. Jane nearly choked on her water. "What about it?" "Your business plan. I've seen the research you've done, but I want to hear about it from you. What kind of bookstore do you want to open?" "You've been looking through my personal files. I've been trying to understand what motivates you. Sue me." Stephen leaned forward, his expression serious. "Most people who work for me are motivated by advancement, recognition, power. You're motivated by something completely different." Jane set down her water glass, considering how much honesty this conversation could handle. "I want to create something. A place where people can discover books they didn't know they needed, where writers can read their work, where the community has a reason to gather that isn't about consuming or competing." That sounds idealistic. "It sounds impossible, you mean?" "I didn't say impossible, I said idealistic." Stephen's voice was gentler than Jane had ever heard it. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I sit, idealism feels like a luxury I can't afford." "Why books? Why not something more practical?" Jane smiled, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. Because books saved my life when I was a kid. My parents divorced when I was 12, and my mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I spent most afternoons in the public library, reading everything I could get my hands on. What kind of books? Everything. Fantasy novels that let me escape to worlds where magic was real. Biographies of women who'd done impossible things. Poetry that made me feel less alone. Jane realized she was talking with her hands, something she only did when she was passionate about a subject. Books taught me that I wasn't the only person who felt lost, you know. That other people had survived worse things and found ways to build meaningful lives. Stephen was watching her with an intensity that made Jane suddenly self-conscious. And now you want to give that gift to other people? I want to try, even if it's idealistic, especially because it's idealistic. Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. The restaurant, the city, the peculiar weather patterns that had been affecting the East Coast. But Jane could feel something different in the air between them, a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before. "Can I ask you something?" Jane said as they waited for dessert. "Shoot. Why did you really offer me this job? And don't say it was about the spilled coffee or the legal damages. You could have destroyed me financially without breaking a sweat, and we both know it." Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "You want the honest answer?" "I always want the honest answer. Because you looked at me like I was human, not like I was Stephen Green, CEO of Green Tech Solutions, worth X number of billions of dollars. You looked at me like I was just a man who was being an asshole to a flight attendant." Jane felt her breath catch. "That's it? You have no idea how rare that is in my world, Jane. Most people either want something from me, or they're afraid of me. You were neither. I was definitely afraid of you. You were afraid of the situation, not of me." Stephen met her eyes across the table. "There's a difference." The waiter brought dessert, something chocolate and decadent that Jane was too nervous to taste. The restaurant was beginning to empty around them, other diners finishing their meals and heading back to their ordinary lives. "What happened to her?" Jane asked quietly. "Your ex-fiancée." Stephen's jaw tightened. "What makes you think anything happened to her?" "Because you're not the kind of man who lets betrayal slide. And because you mentioned losing $40 million, which suggests consequences beyond a broken engagement. Her name was Lydia Morrison. We met at a clean energy conference, started dating, got engaged 8 months later." Stephen's voice was carefully controlled. "She was smart, beautiful, interested in the work I was doing, or so I thought. But she wasn't. She was interested in the work I was doing because her previous employer was paying her to be interested. Industrial espionage disguised as romance." Stephen's laugh was bitter. "I found out 3 days before our wedding, when my head of security presented me with evidence that she'd been photographing documents, copying files, passing along proprietary information for over a year. What did you do?" "I confronted her. She denied everything, then tried to convince me that she'd only done it because she was afraid of me, afraid of what I might do if she refused." Stephen's eyes were hard as glass. "As if I was the kind of man who would threaten someone I claimed to love." Jane felt a chill run down her spine. "But you are the kind of man who would threaten someone. You threatened me. That was different." "How?" "Because I never claimed to love you." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Jane felt something shift in her chest. Disappointment, maybe, or relief. She wasn't sure which was more dangerous. "So you sued her." "I destroyed her. Professionally, financially, socially. It took 6 months and cost me more than the money she'd cost me, but she'll never work in tech again. Never work anywhere that requires a security clearance or background check. That seems excessive." That seems like justice. Jane studied Stephen's face, seeing the coldness that had taken over his expression when he talked about Lydia Morrison. This was the man who'd threatened her with $23 million in damages over spilled coffee. This was the man who controlled everything in his life with mathematical precision. But it was also the man who'd laughed at her jokes tonight, who'd asked about her dreams with genuine interest, who'd admitted that she made him feel human. "I should get you home," Stephen said, signaling for the check. "Early morning tomorrow." Stephen: "Thank you for dinner, Jane. You were right. I needed to prove that I could have a normal conversation with an intelligent woman without letting my past dictate my present." "And did you prove it?" Stephen's smile was complicated, full of shadows and possibilities that Jane didn't know how to interpret. "Ask me tomorrow." The ride back to Jane's apartment passed in comfortable silence, jazz music filling the spaces where conversation might have been. When Stephen pulled up to her building, Jane found herself reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth and possibility that the evening had created. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her hand on the door handle. "It was unexpected. Nice. It was nice to see you as a person instead of just my boss." "Don't get used to it," Stephen said, but his tone was gentle, almost teasing. "Tomorrow we go back to being professional." "Of course. Strictly professional." But as Jane walked into her building, she caught Stephen watching her in the reflection of the glass doors, and she wondered if going back to strictly professional was going to be as simple as either of them hoped. Over the next 2 weeks, Jane discovered that having dinner with Stephen had shifted something fundamental in their working relationship. He was still demanding, still exacting in his standards, still completely focused on business during business hours. But there were moments, small, almost imperceptible changes that suggested the evening had affected him too. He asked about her mother's health without being prompted. He remembered that she preferred her coffee with cream, not milk. When he worked late, he made sure she ordered dinner for herself along with his own meal. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, Jane caught him watching her with an expression that was harder to read than his usual corporate mask. "The Chen meeting went well," Jane said, settling into the chair across from Stephen's desk with her daily briefing notes. "She's interested in the solar storage project, wants to see a full proposal by the end of the month." "Good. What else?" "Your mother called. Sunday dinner this week. No excuses. She said to tell you that Rebecca is bringing the new boyfriend, and if you miss it, you'll have to hear about him secondhand, which will be much more painful for everyone involved." Stephen looked up from his computer. She actually said that. Your family has a gift for emotional manipulation. It's not manipulation when it works." Jane made a note on her tablet. "So you'll go?" "I'll go." "What else?" "The Renewable Energy Summit in Chicago next month. I've confirmed your keynote speech, booked the hotel, arranged ground transportation. You'll fly out Thursday, speak Friday morning, fly back Friday afternoon. Change it." "Change what?" "I want to stay through the weekend. There are some people I should see while I'm there, some research facilities worth visiting." Stephen saved his document and leaned back in his chair. "Book us through Sunday." "Us? You're coming with me. I'll need you to manage the schedule, coordinate meetings, handle correspondence." Stephen's tone was matter-of-fact, as if asking his assistant to travel with him was completely routine. "Is that a problem?" Jane felt her pulse quicken. A weekend in Chicago, 3 days away from the office, away from the carefully structured boundaries of their professional relationship. "No problem," she said. "I'll arrange separate rooms, separate transportation to events." "Jane." "Yes, we're adults. I think we can manage to travel together without it becoming complicated." "Right, of course." But as Jane made notes about flight times and hotel reservations, she wondered if Stephen really believed that, or if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in November, when Jane arrived at the office to find Stephen pacing behind his desk like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear and his free hand running through his hair in a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. "I don't care what the lawyers say," he was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Find me another option." "Find me 3 other options." Jane set his coffee on the desk and retreated to her own workspace, but she could feel the tension radiating from Stephen's office like heat from a fire. When he finally emerged 20 minutes later, his face was grim. "Cancel everything for today," he said. "Everything except the Morrison call at 3. "What's wrong?" "The Patterson deal is falling apart. 3 years of work, 40 million in development costs, and Patterson Industries has decided they'd rather partner with Gen Solar instead of us." Jane felt a chill run down her spine. She'd worked on the Patterson files, knew how important the deal was to Stephen's expansion plans. "What happened?" "Someone leaked our bid specifications. Patterson knew exactly what to offer Gen Solar to beat our proposal." Stephen's voice was deadly calm. "Industrial espionage." "Again." "Do you know who?" "I have suspicions, but suspicions don't rebuild 3 years of work." Jane watched Stephen move to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "What can I do?" "Nothing. This isn't the kind of problem you can solve by reorganizing my calendar or making coffee." Stephen's tone was bitter. "This is the kind of problem that makes me remember why I don't trust anyone." "You trust me?" Stephen turned to look at her, and Jane saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Do I?" "I thought you did. I thought I did too. But trusting people has cost me a lot of money lately." The implication hit Jane like a physical blow. "You think I leaked the information?" "I think someone did. And you're the only person who's had access to the Patterson files outside of my senior staff." Jane felt the world tilt around her. "Stephen, I would never—" "Lydia said the same thing, right up until the moment I showed her the evidence." "I'm not Lydia." "No. Then explain how Gen Solar knew our exact specifications. Explain how they knew about the battery technology we've been developing in secret for 2 years. Jane's mind raced through the possibilities, through every file she'd accessed, every document she'd handled. "I don't know, but it wasn't me." "Of course not. It never is." The coldness in Stephen's voice was worse than anger would have been. This was the man who'd destroyed his ex-fiancée, who'd threatened to sue Jane into oblivion over spilled coffee. This was the man who'd learned not to trust anyone, and she'd been foolish enough to think she might be different. "What do you want me to do?" Jane asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I want you to stay in your office while I figure out how much damage has been done. I want you to keep your mouth shut about Patterson Industries and Gen Solar and everything else you might have overheard in the past 2 months. And then what?" Stephen's smile was sharp as a blade. "And then we'll see if your contract includes protections against corporate espionage." Jane spent the rest of the day in her office, managing Stephen's calls and appointments, while her mind raced through everything that had happened since she'd started working for him. Someone had leaked information to Gen Solar, that much was clear, but it wasn't her, and the fact that Stephen automatically suspected her revealed exactly how fragile the trust between them really was. By 5 o'clock, Jane had made a decision. She knocked on Stephen's office door and entered without waiting for permission. "I'm resigning." Stephen looked up from his computer, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me? I'm resigning. Effective immediately. I'll pack my things and be out of the apartment by tonight." "You can't resign. You have a contract." "Then fire me. Destroy me. Do whatever you need to do to feel in control again." Jane moved closer to his desk, her hands shaking with anger and hurt, and something that might have been heartbreak. "But I'm not going to stay here and be treated like a criminal because you're too damaged to believe that someone might actually be loyal to you." Stephen stood up slowly. "Jane, no! You've made it clear that you think I'm capable of betraying you for money, that despite everything we've shared, everything I've done to prove myself, you still see me as just another Lydia Morrison. That's not. It is exactly that. And you know what? Maybe you're right not to trust me. Maybe you're right not to trust anyone. But I can't work for someone who assumes the worst about me every time something goes wrong." Jane turned toward the door, but Stephen's voice stopped her. "I found the leak." She froze, her hand on the door handle. "What?" 20 minutes ago. My head of security identified the source. It wasn't you." Jane turned around slowly, studying Stephen's face for any sign of deception. "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to see how you'd react. I wanted to see if you'd run or if you'd fight." The admission hit Jane like a slap. "You tested me." "I needed to know." "You needed to know what? Whether I was lying? Whether I was guilty? Whether I would abandon you the moment things got difficult? All of it. Any of it." Stephen moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. I needed to know if you were going to disappear the first time I acted like the damaged, paranoid bastard that I actually am." "And what did you learn?" "That you're willing to walk away from the best job you've ever had, rather than stay somewhere you're not trusted. That you'd rather lose everything than compromise your integrity." Jane felt tears stinging her eyes, anger and relief, and something deeper warring in her chest. "That doesn't make this okay, Stephen. You can't treat people like lab rats just because you're afraid of being hurt again. I know. Do you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've learned all the wrong lessons from what Lydia did to you." Stephen was close enough now that Jane could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of constant vigilance that he carried like armor. "You're right," he said quietly. "I have learned all the wrong lessons. I've spent 2 years building walls so high that I can't see over them anymore, then tear them down. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Choose to trust people. Choose to believe that not everyone is out to hurt you. Choose to stop punishing the people who care about you for crimes they didn't commit." Stephen reached out as if to touch her face, then dropped his hand before making contact. "And what if I can't?" "Then you'll spend the rest of your life alone in your perfect, controlled, empty world. And you'll deserve it." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Jane saw the exact moment when something shifted in Stephen's expression. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been hope. "Don't resign," he said. "Give me a reason to stay. Because I need you. Not just as an assistant, not just as someone to manage my schedule and protect me from distractions. I need you because you're the only person who's brave enough to tell me when I'm being an ass. You're being an ass right now. I know. That's why I need you to stay." Jane studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide beneath his usual corporate mask. "What happens the next time someone betrays you? What happens when you get scared and decide that I must be the enemy? I don't know, but I'd like the chance to find out." It wasn't enough. It wasn't a promise or a guarantee or anything approaching the kind of security that Jane needed, but it was honest, and in Stephen's world, honesty was perhaps the most valuable thing he could offer. "One more chance," Jane said. "Oh, but if you ever test me again, if you ever assume I'm guilty just because someone else was, I'm gone. Contract or no contract, lawsuit or no lawsuit, I'm gone. Understood? And you owe me an apology, a real one." Stephen's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. I'm sorry, Jane. For testing you, for not trusting you, for being the kind of man who assumes the worst about people who've done nothing but try to help him. Apology accepted. This time, as Jane moved toward the door, Stephen's voice stopped her once more. Jane, yes, thank you for fighting back. For not letting me get away with being a coward. Jane paused in the doorway, her heart beating too fast and her mind racing with possibilities she didn't want to examine too closely. Don't thank me yet, she said. We still have 8 months left on my contract. Plenty of time for you to prove whether you've actually learned anything. But as Jane returned to her office, she found herself hoping, against her better judgment, against all evidence and experience, that Stephen Green might actually be worth the risk of believing in him, and that terrified her more than any lawsuit ever could. The Chicago Renewable Energy Summit was everything Jane had expected. Endless panels about solar efficiency, networking events where people discussed carbon footprints over wine and cheese, and Stephen in his element, commanding rooms full of industry leaders with the kind of quiet authority that made her understand why he'd built an empire before he was 40. What Jane hadn't expected was to enjoy herself. But watching Stephen deliver his keynote speech, seeing the way he lit up when he talked about sustainable technology and the possibility of a cleaner future, she found herself remembering why she'd been drawn to him in the first place. Beneath the corporate armor and emotional walls was a man who genuinely believed he could change the world. You were brilliant up there, Jane said as they walked back to their hotel after the conference dinner. Chicago's November air was sharp and clean, cutting through the warmth of wine and good conversation. It felt good to talk about the work instead of the business for once, Stephen replied, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Sometimes I forget why I started the company in the first place, which was because I wanted to build something that mattered. Something that would still matter long after I was gone. They walked in comfortable silence through the downtown streets, past restaurants and shops glowing with warm light. Jane found herself acutely aware of Stephen beside her, the way he moved, the sound of his breathing, the fact that for the first time in months he seemed genuinely relaxed. Thank you, he said as they reached the hotel lobby. For what? For coming with me. For making this feel less like work and more like, Stephen paused, searching for words, more like something I actually wanted to do. The elevator ride to their floor passed in charged silence. Their rooms were across the hall from each other, and Jane found herself lingering in the hallway, reluctant to end an evening that had felt more like a real partnership than anything they'd shared before. Jane! Stephen's voice was soft, uncertain in a way that made her chest tighten. Yes? Would you like to have a drink? There's a bottle of wine in my room from the hotel. And I'm not ready for tonight to end. Jane felt her pulse quicken. Stephen. Just a drink. Just two people who've had a good day and want to extend it a little longer. She should say no. Should go to her own room, maintain the professional boundaries that had already become dangerously blurred, should remember that Stephen Green was her employer, not her friend, and certainly not anything more. One drink, she heard herself say. Stephen's suite was twice the size of her room, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. He moved to the minibar, extracting a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Jane's monthly rent. Tell me something, Stephen said, pouring wine into 2 glasses. If you could open your bookstore anywhere in the world, where would it be? Jane accepted the wine, settling into one of the plush chairs by the window. That's easy. There's a small town in Vermont I visited once during college. Woodstock. Main Street lined with maple trees, mountains in the distance, the kind of place where people actually know their neighbors. Sounds peaceful. Sounds impossible, Do you know what commercial real estate costs in picture-perfect Vermont towns? Do you know what commercial real estate costs when you have the right backing? Stephen moved to the window, wine glass in hand. Money can make impossible things possible, Jane. Not everything. Money can't make people trust you, can't make them love you, can't undo the damage when you've hurt someone you care about. Stephen turned to look at her, and Jane saw something raw in his expression. Is that what you think? That I've hurt you? I think you've hurt yourself more than anyone else, but yes, sometimes your damage splashes onto other people. I never wanted to hurt you. I know. That's what makes it complicated. Stephen moved closer, settling into the chair across from hers. The space between them felt charged with electricity, heavy with months of carefully controlled attraction and growing emotional intimacy. What would make it less complicated, he asked. Jane set down her wine glass, her hands trembling slightly. Honesty. Complete honesty about what this is, what we are to each other. What do you think we are? I think we're two people who started as adversaries and became something else, something that doesn't have a name or a category or clear boundaries. And what do you want us to be? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Jane felt the weight of months of unspoken feelings pressing against her chest. I want us to be people who don't have to pretend that working together is just work, who don't have to analyze every conversation for hidden meanings or professional implications. Jane's voice was barely above a whisper. I want us to be people who can sit in a hotel room in Chicago and admit that we care about each other, without it feeling like the end of the world. Stephen stood slowly, moving to the window where the city lights painted his profile in gold and shadow. Jane, you don't have to say anything. I know this is complicated. I know you don't do relationships or trust or any of the messy human things that make life worth living. That's not... Stephen turned back to face her, and Jane saw something shift in his expression. You're wrong about me. Am I? I do trust you, more than I've trusted anyone in years, and I do care about you. More than I should, more than is smart, more than I know how to handle. Jane felt her breath catch. Stephen. But you're right about one thing. This is complicated. You work for me. I'm responsible for your financial future, your career, your ability to achieve your dreams. Those are just details. Those are the details that could destroy both of us if we get this wrong. Jane stood, moving to where Stephen waited by the window. Chicago spread out below them like a circuit board. Millions of lights representing millions of people, making millions of choices about love and risk and the courage required to reach for something that might be wonderful or might be disastrous. What if we get it right? She asked. Stephen reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart race. What if we don't? Then we deal with the consequences. Together. For a moment, they stood on the edge of something that would change everything. Jane could see the war playing out in Stephen's expression, want and fear, hope and control. The part of him that craved connection, battling the part that had learned to survive through isolation. Jane, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know. If we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back to just being boss and employee. I know. Stephen's thumb traced her lower lip, and Jane felt her entire world narrow to this moment, this choice, this man who'd become so much more than she'd ever expected. Are you sure? Instead of answering, Jane rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss started soft, tentative, a question rather than a statement. But when Stephen's arms came around her, when he pulled her closer and deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched her own, Jane felt something fundamental shift between them. This wasn't her boss kissing his employee. This wasn't a power dynamic or a professional complication. This was Stephen, vulnerable, damaged, brilliant Stephen, choosing to trust her with something precious and fragile. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Stephen rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" Jane whispered. "I don't know, but I'd like to find out." They talked until dawn, curled together on the hotel room couch as the city woke up below them. They talked about everything. Stephen's childhood as the son of immigrants who'd built a small construction business into something substantial. Jane's dreams of traveling to all the places she'd read about in books. The moment when Stephen had realized that renewable energy wasn't just good business, but necessary business for the future of the planet. "And I never told Lydia about my parents," Stephen said, his fingers tracing patterns on Jane's arm as she rested against his shoulder. "About how they came here with nothing, how my father worked construction 16 hours a day so my mother could take English classes at night. Why not? Because I thought if I kept certain parts of myself separate, she couldn't use them against me. I thought if I only showed her the successful businessman, she couldn't hurt the parts of me that actually mattered." Jane shifted to look at his face. "But she hurt you anyway." "She did. But not because she knew my vulnerabilities. She hurt me because I chose to trust someone who wasn't worthy of trust." "How do you know who's worthy?" Stephen's smile was sad and honest. "You don't. You make your best guess and hope you're right." They flew back to New York Sunday evening, and Jane felt the weight of reality settling over them as the plane descended toward JFK. In Chicago, they'd been just Stephen and Jane, two people discovering they cared about each other. But in New York, they were CEO and assistant, employer and employee. Two people whose personal relationship could complicate everything they'd built professionally. "We need to talk about how this affects work," Stephen said, as their taxi pulled into Manhattan traffic. "Does it have to affect work?" "Everything affects work, Jane. The question is whether we're smart enough to manage the complications." "What kind of complications?" Stephen was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights stream past the window. "What happens when we disagree about something? What happens when I need to be your boss and you need me to be something else? What happens when one of us wants something the other can't give? We figure it out, like adults. And if we can't figure it out..." Jane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "Are you already looking for reasons this won't work?" "I'm trying to be realistic about the challenges." "No, you're trying to build an escape route. You're planning your exit strategy before we've even tried to make this work." Stephen turned to look at her, and Jane saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of her, but fear of himself, of his own capacity for sabotage. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly. "Then don't. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. Choose not to hurt me. Choose to trust this. Choose to believe that maybe, for once, something good can happen without it being destroyed." The taxi pulled up to Jane's building, and she felt the weight of an ending she didn't want to acknowledge. "Jane?" "Yes." "Whatever happens, whatever complications arise, I want you to know that this weekend meant something to me. You mean something to me." Jane leaned over and kissed him softly, tasting goodbye on his lips, even though neither of them had said the word. "To see you tomorrow morning," she said. "See you tomorrow." But as Jane rode the elevator to her apartment, she had the sinking feeling that tomorrow would bring them back to the safety of professional distance, and that the man who'd held her until dawn in Chicago would disappear behind the armor of Stephen Green, CEO. Jane was right. Monday morning brought a return to careful formality, professional boundaries, and the kind of polite distance that made the weekend feel like a dream. Stephen was cordial but remote, focused on business with an intensity that felt deliberate. "The Patterson replacement deal is moving forward," Jane said, delivering his morning coffee with the same efficiency she'd shown for months. "Day Legal wants to review the confidentiality agreements one more time, but we should be ready to sign by Friday." Good. What else? Lunch with the senators from the Energy Committee, 3 o'clock, meeting with the new investors, dinner with your sister to discuss your mother's birthday party. Stephen looked up from his computer. I didn't agree to dinner with Rebecca. You did, last week. She called while you were in the Morrison meeting, and you told me to handle it however I thought best. I meant reschedule it. I meant accept it. Your family misses you, Stephen. And after Chicago, I thought you might be ready to let people back into your life. For a moment, something flickered in Stephen's expression. Warmth, recognition, the ghost of the man who'd talked to her until dawn. Then the corporate mask slid back into place. And after Chicago, we agreed to be realistic about managing complications. My family dinner schedule seems like exactly the kind of personal matter that should stay personal. The words hit Jane like a slap. Of course. My mistake. She turned to leave, but Stephen's voice stopped her. Jane. Yes. Book the dinner with Rebecca. You're right, I should see my family more often. It was a small concession, but it felt like a victory. As Jane returned to her desk, she allowed herself to hope that maybe Stephen was just being cautious, that maybe they could find a way to balance their personal and professional lives without destroying either. She was still holding on to that hope when Lydia Morrison walked into the office Wednesday afternoon. Jane recognized her immediately from the photos she'd seen during her research into Stephen's background. Tall, elegant, with the kind of understated beauty that came from good genetics and expensive maintenance. She moved through the reception area with the confidence of someone who belonged in places like this, someone who expected doors to open and obstacles to disappear. And I'm here to see Stephen, Lydia said, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that Jane couldn't place. Do you have an appointment? I'm Lydia Morrison. I don't need an appointment. Jane felt her stomach drop. Mr. Green is in meetings all afternoon. I'd be happy to schedule something for next week. Just tell him I'm here. He'll see me. Before Jane could respond, Stephen's office door opened and he emerged, stopping short when he saw Lydia standing in the reception area. What are you doing here? His voice was carefully controlled, but Jane could see the tension that immediately gripped his shoulders. Hello, Stephen. You look well. You didn't answer my question. Lydia smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she knew secrets others didn't. I think we should talk privately. Unless you want your staff to hear about why I'm here. Jane saw Stephen's jaw tighten, saw the calculation playing out behind his eyes. 5 minutes. It'll take longer than 5 minutes. 5 minutes, Lydia. In my office, then you leave. As Stephen and Lydia disappeared into his office, Jane felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Through the glass walls, she could see them talking, Lydia animated and persuasive, Stephen rigid, with the kind of control that suggested he was fighting not to lose his temper. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, not 5. When Lydia finally emerged, she was smiling with the satisfaction of someone who'd gotten exactly what she wanted. It was nice meeting you, she said to Jane as she gathered her purse. You seem very dedicated to Stephen. I hope he appreciates that. Jane watched Lydia leave, then waited for Stephen to call her into his office to explain what had just happened, but the call never came. Instead, Stephen kept his door closed for the rest of the afternoon, emerging only to leave for his dinner with Rebecca without so much as a goodbye. You're being paranoid, Jane told herself as she sat in her apartment that evening, trying to focus on a book instead of replaying every moment of Lydia Morrison's unexpected visit. Stephen said she was part of his past, not his present. Whatever she wanted, it doesn't have anything to do with you. But Thursday morning brought a new Stephen, colder, more distant, the walls back up higher than ever. He spoke to Jane only when necessary, avoided eye contact, and seemed to be going out of his way to emphasize the employer-employee nature of their relationship. "Is everything all right?" Jane finally asked Friday afternoon, when the silence had become unbearable. "Everything's fine. Why wouldn't it be?" "Because you've barely spoken to me in 2 days. Because you're acting like Chicago never happened. Because your ex-fiancé showed up and now you're treating me like a stranger." Stephen looked up from his computer, his expression unreadable. "Chicago was a mistake, Jane. We both got carried away by the change of scenery, the wine, the temporary break from reality. But this is reality. This is you running away. This is me being responsible for both of us." Jane felt something break inside her chest. "What did she say to you? Who? Don't play dumb, Stephen. Lydia. What did she tell you that made you decide Chicago was a mistake?" "Lydia's visit has nothing to do with this. Everything about your behavior says otherwise." Stephen saved his document and leaned back in his chair, studying Jane with the kind of cold assessment she hadn't seen since their first flight together. "What do you want me to say, Jane? That I made a professional error in judgment? That I allowed personal feelings to compromise a business relationship? You're right, I did. That's not what happened, and you know it. What I know is that mixing business and personal relationships is a recipe for disaster. What I know is that I have a company to run, and you have a job to do, and neither of those things benefits from the complications we created in Chicago." Jane stood slowly, her hands shaking with anger and hurt. "You're a coward. Excuse me. You're a coward who's so afraid of being hurt again that you'd rather destroy something good than risk finding out it might be real. I'm protecting both of us. You're protecting yourself, and you're using Lydia's visit as an excuse to run back to your safe, controlled, emotionally sterile world where no one can touch you." Stephen's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it to me. Tell me what she said that was so devastating it erased everything we shared." "She didn't say anything devastating. She reminded me of the reality of my situation." "Which is what?" "Which is that I can't afford to trust people with access to my business, my life, my heart. The cost is too high." Jane felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And I'm just another person with access." "You're my employee, Jane. That's what you've always been." The words hit Jane like a physical blow, and she saw the exact moment when Stephen realized he'd gone too far. Something flickered across his face. Regret, pain, the recognition that he'd just destroyed something precious out of fear. "Jane, no, you're right. I'm your employee. Nothing more." Jane moved toward the door, her voice steady despite the devastation in her chest. "I'll finish out my contract because I honor my commitments. But don't expect me to pretend that Chicago meant anything to me either." "Jane, wait." But Jane was already gone, leaving Stephen alone in his perfect, controlled office with the wreckage of what might have been the best thing that had ever happened to him. The next 6 weeks passed in a haze of professional courtesy and emotional distance. Jane performed her duties with flawless efficiency, managing Stephen's schedule, handling his correspondence, protecting him from distractions with the same dedication she'd always shown. But the warmth was gone, the easy conversation, the sense of partnership that had made their working relationship something special. Stephen tried in his way to bridge the gap between them. Small gestures, remembering her coffee preference, asking about her mother's health, approving time off for her to visit doctors and handle personal business. But Jane met each overture with polite professionalism, and gradually Stephen stopped trying. "You're both miserable," Rebecca said one Sunday afternoon when she cornered Stephen at their mother's house. You spend all your time at work. You look like you haven't slept in weeks, and every time I mention Jane's name, you get that look. What look? Like someone just kicked your puppy. What happened between you two? Nothing happened. We have a professional relationship. Bullshit. I've seen the way you look at her, Stephen. I've seen the way she looks at you. Or looked at you, before you did whatever stupid thing you did to screw it up. Stephen stabbed at his mother's pot roast with unnecessary violence. I didn't screw anything up. I maintained appropriate boundaries. You're an idiot. Thank you. Always helpful. You're in love with her. Stephen set down his fork. Rebecca, you're in love with her and she's in love with you, and instead of doing something about it like a normal person, you're both pretending to be robots. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You love her, she loves you. Ask her out properly instead of whatever weird boss employee dance you've been doing. She works for me. So fire her or promote her or give her a different job. Use your billions of dollars and figure it out. Stephen looked around his mother's dining room, at the family photos covering every surface, at the mismatched furniture that had been collected over 40 years of marriage, at the evidence of a life built on love and compromise and the willingness to risk everything for another person. What if I hurt her? What if you don't? What if she's better off without me? Rebecca leaned across the table, fixing Stephen with the kind of look that only younger sisters could deliver. Oh, what if you're wrong about everything, and the only thing standing between you and happiness is your own fear? Jane's letter of resignation arrived on Stephen's desk Monday morning, along with a folder containing detailed notes about his schedule, ongoing projects, and recommendations for her replacement. My contract expires in 37 days, the letter read. I'm providing formal notice that I will not be seeking renewal or extension. I've prepared comprehensive transition materials to ensure minimal disruption to your business operations. Thank you for the opportunity to work with Green Tech Solutions. It was perfectly professional, completely impersonal, and it made Stephen feel like someone had reached into his chest and torn out his heart. He found Jane in the supply room, boxing up her personal items with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else. You can't resign. I can, and I did. Check the contract. 30 days. Notice for non-renewal. Jane, please, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. You made your position clear. I'm your employee, nothing more. When my employment ends, our relationship ends. Stephen watched her pack books and photos into a small cardboard box, each item disappearing like another piece of the life they'd built together. What if I don't want our relationship to end? Jane's hands stilled on a coffee mug that read, World's Okayest Assistant, a gift Rebecca had given her after they'd met at a company Christmas party. And then you should have thought about that before you decided Chicago was a mistake. I was scared. I know. I was protecting myself. I know that too. Jane, look at me. She turned, and Stephen saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the hurt she'd been carrying for weeks. I made a mistake, he said, the biggest mistake of my life. I let fear make my decisions instead of hope, and I hurt the person who means more to me than anyone else in the world. Stephen, I love you. The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Jane's eyes filled with tears, but her expression remained guarded. You love the idea of me, the fantasy of someone who can fix your trust issues and make you feel normal. But you don't love me enough to actually trust me when it matters. That's not true. Isn't it? What did Lydia tell you that made you decide I was a threat? Stephen ran his hands through his hair, the gesture Jane had come to recognize as a sign of his internal struggle. She told me you'd been asking questions about the Patterson deal, specific questions about timeline, about our competitors, about information that hadn't been made public. I was doing my job. I always ask questions when I'm trying to understand your business. I know that now. I knew it then, intellectually, but emotionally, you assumed I was another Lydia. You assumed I was capable of betraying you for money. For 30 seconds, I let old fears override everything I knew about you. Jane closed the box, sealing it with tape that sounded final in the quiet room. 30 seconds was enough. It doesn't have to be. Yes, it does. Because the next time someone plants doubt about me, the next time you're scared or hurt or feeling vulnerable, you'll do the same thing. You'll choose fear over trust, suspicion over faith. Stephen wanted to argue, wanted to promise that he'd learned his lesson, that he'd never doubt her again, but the words wouldn't come because they both knew Jane was right. So that's it. You're just going to walk away. I'm going to walk away while I still have some dignity left, while I still remember what it felt like to matter to someone. You do matter to me. Not enough. Jane picked up her box and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at Stephen one last time. For what it's worth, I love you too. I love you enough to forgive the Patterson suspicion, enough to overlook the emotional walls, enough to believe you could change if you wanted to badly enough. Jane. But I love myself too much to stay with someone who's determined to destroy everything good in his life out of fear. The days after Jane's resignation felt like living in a house where all the color had been drained away. Stephen tried to maintain his routines, morning meetings, conference calls, the endless stream of decisions that kept his business empire running. But everything felt muted, mechanical, as if he were going through the motions of a life that no longer held any meaning. His new assistant was competent, professional, everything an executive assistant should be. She managed his schedule with precision, handled his correspondence efficiently, and never challenged his decisions, or made him laugh, or looked at him like he was human rather than just another billionaire. "You look terrible," his mother said when he showed up for Sunday dinner 2 weeks after Jane's departure. "Thank you, always helpful." "Where's Jane?" "I was hoping to finally meet her properly. Jane no longer works for me." "What happened?" Stephen pushed food around his plate, not trusting himself to meet his mother's eyes. "We had professional differences that made you look like someone killed your dog." "Mom!" "Stephen Michael Green, I've been watching you stumble through relationships for 40 years, and I've never seen you look this destroyed over professional differences. It's complicated. It's always complicated. The question is whether it's worth uncomplicated." Rebecca chose that moment to arrive with her new boyfriend, a cheerful marketing executive who immediately launched into enthusiastic conversation about renewable energy and the future of sustainable technology. Stephen listened with half an ear, his mind drifting to all the conversations he'd had with Jane about the same topics, the way she'd challenged his assumptions and made him think about his work in new ways. "Your brother seems distracted," he heard Rebecca's boyfriend say to her in the kitchen. "He's in love with someone he's too stupid to fight for," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying clearly into the dining room. "That's rough. What's the story?" "The story is that Stephen has spent so many years protecting himself from being hurt that he's forgotten how to let anyone close enough to matter." Stephen stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I'm leaving." "Stephen," his mother started, "I have work to do. It's Sunday. Work doesn't care what day it is." But instead of going home to his empty apartment or his sterile office, Stephen found himself driving through Queens, past neighborhoods he'd never visited, until he reached the address he'd memorized from Jane's employee file. Her building was exactly what he'd expected: small, affordable, the kind of place where young people lived while they saved money and figured out their lives. The studio apartment he'd convinced her to leave was on the 3rd floor, and Stephen sat in his car across the street, staring up at windows that glowed with warm light. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there. Probably reading, probably planning the bookstore she'd open with the money she'd earned working for him, probably building the life she'd always wanted, a life that didn't include him. Stephen drove home through the city he'd conquered, past the buildings that housed his offices, and the restaurants where he conducted business, and the landmarks that marked his territory. But for the first time in his adult life, success felt hollow. Achievement felt meaningless, and the empire he'd built felt like a very expensive prison. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, jarring Stephen from the restless sleep that had become his norm. "Mr. Green, this is Dr. Martinez at Queen's General Hospital. I'm calling about Jane Harris. You're listed as her emergency contact." Stephen was out of bed before the doctor finished speaking, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What happened? Is she all right?" "Ms. Harris was in a car accident tonight. She's stable, but she has a concussion and some broken ribs. She's asking for you." Stephen was dressed and in his car within 5 minutes, racing through empty Manhattan streets toward Queens. The hospital was exactly the kind of place Jane would end up, understaffed, overwhelmed, filled with people who couldn't afford better options. He found her in the emergency room, pale and small against the hospital bed, with a bandage on her forehead and bruises already darkening along her jaw. "Hey," she said when she saw him, her voice hoarse but attempting a smile. "Hey, yourself. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." "Which, technically, I guess I did." Stephen pulled a chair close to her bed, resisting the urge to take her hand. "What happened?" "Guy ran a red light, T-boned me at the intersection near my apartment." Jane shifted carefully, wincing as the movement aggravated her ribs. Could have been worse, could have been a lot worse. "Jane, why am I still your emergency contact, Stephen?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" "I quit 6 weeks ago. I should have given them someone else's number." Stephen looked down at his hands, not trusting himself to meet her eyes. "Because I never updated the forms, because some part of me hoped you might need me someday." "I always need you. That was never the problem." "Then what was the problem?" Jane turned her head to look at him fully, and Stephen saw something in her expression that he'd been afraid to hope for. "The problem was that you didn't believe you needed me, too." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the hospital around them, monitors beeping, voices in the hallway, the constant hum of a place where people fought for their lives and their futures. "I bought the bookstore," Jane said suddenly. Stephen felt his heart stop. "What?" "In Vermont, the one I told you about in Chicago. The owner decided to retire, and she offered it to me for a price I could actually afford." Jane's smile was soft, dreamy. "I'm moving next month." "Congratulations! That's wonderful." "Is it?" "It's what you've always wanted." "What I've always wanted was to build something meaningful with someone I loved. The bookstore is just the location." Stephen felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. "Oh, Jane, I meant what I said, you know, about loving you enough to forgive the Patterson thing, enough to overlook the emotional walls. But I also meant what I said about loving myself too much to stay with someone who's determined to destroy everything good in his life." "I know. So the question is, are you still determined to destroy everything good? Or are you ready to fight for something worth keeping?" Stephen looked at Jane, bruised and bandaged, but still the strongest person he'd ever known, still willing to offer him another chance despite everything he'd done to hurt her. "I don't know how to fight for something like this," he admitted. "I only know how to fight against things. Then learn. Figure it out. Use some of that brilliant business mind to solve the problem of how to love someone without controlling them." "And if I can't figure it out?" Jane's smile was sad but genuine. "Then I'll run a bookstore in Vermont and remember that once, for a brief moment, I was brave enough to love a man who was too scared to love me back." Stephen left the hospital as dawn was breaking over Queens, Jane's words echoing in his mind as he drove back toward Manhattan. But instead of going home or to the office, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small diner that advertised 24-hour breakfast in faded neon letters. He sat in a booth by the window, drinking coffee that was stronger and better than anything his expensive office machine produced, and thought about everything Jane had said, about fighting for something instead of against it, about loving someone without controlling them, about being brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of something real. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Mom says you left dinner early Sunday because you're being an idiot about Jane. She's right. Fix it." Stephen stared at the message, then typed back, "Working on it." Working on what exactly? Figuring out how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like Jane. Start by apologizing, then grovel. Then grovel some more. "Thanks for the advice, Stephen. Yeah, she loves you. Even after everything, she loves you. Don't waste that." Stephen paid for his coffee and drove to his office, where he spent the next 8 hours making calls, sending emails, and rearranging his life in ways that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. 3 days later, Stephen Green stood on the front porch of a small bookstore in Woodstock, Vermont, holding a cup of coffee and watching through the window as Jane Harris unpacked boxes of books with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about. The town was exactly as she'd described it. Main Street lined with maple trees, mountains in the distance, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and life moved at a pace that allowed for conversation and contemplation. Stephen had never lived anywhere like this, had never wanted to. But watching Jane arrange books on shelves with the same care she'd once brought to managing his schedule, he found himself imagining what it might be like to build a life in a place where success was measured in relationships rather than revenue. Jane looked up and saw him through the window. For a moment, she just stared, as if trying to determine whether he was real or a hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much manual labor. Then she walked to the door and opened it, leaning against the frame with an expression Stephen couldn't read. "You're a long way from Manhattan," she said. 250 miles, according to my GPS. "What are you doing here, Stephen?" "I came to see your bookstore and to ask if you might have a job opening." Jane's eyebrows rose. "A job opening?" "I'm between careers at the moment. I sold my company." "You what?" Stephen gestured toward the coffee shop across the street. "Can we sit down? This is a longer conversation than a doorway can accommodate." The coffee shop was exactly the kind of place Stephen had spent his adult life avoiding. Mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, a menu written on a chalkboard in handwriting that suggested the owner had never heard of corporate branding. But the coffee was excellent, and the woman behind the counter greeted Jane by name and asked about her mother's health with genuine interest. "You sold green tech solutions?" Jane said, once they were settled at a corner table. "The company you built from nothing. The company that was going to change the world. I sold it to a consortium of renewable energy companies that will do a better job of changing the world than I was doing. I was too focused on control, on maintaining market position. They're focused on innovation, on actually solving problems." "Stephen, I kept a minority stake, enough to ensure the technology gets developed responsibly, but I'm no longer running the day-to-day operations." Jane stared at him as if he'd just announced he was joining the circus. "Why?" "Because running a company required all of my time, all of my attention, all of my emotional energy, and I wanted to save some of that for other things." "What kind of other things?" Stephen reached across the table, covering Jane's hand with his own. "The kind of things that matter, like learning how to love someone without controlling them, like building a relationship that's based on partnership instead of power dynamics." "You sold your company for me." "I sold my company for us. For the possibility of an us that actually works. Jane was quiet for a long moment, her fingers intertwined with his. What if there is no us? What if too much damage has been done? Then I'll have learned something valuable about myself, and you'll have a neighbor who's very good at organizing inventory and managing supply chains. You want to move to Vermont. I want to move wherever you are. Vermont, Manhattan, the surface of the moon. I spent 40 years building walls to protect myself from getting hurt, and the only thing those walls accomplished was keeping out the one person who could have made all of it worthwhile. Jane's eyes filled with tears. Stephen. I love you, Jane. Not the idea of you, not the fantasy of someone who can fix me, but you. The woman who tells me when I'm being an ass, who challenges my assumptions, who makes me want to be better than I am. I love you too. But love isn't enough if you can't trust me. Then it's a good thing I trust you completely. Do you, really? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear? Stephen pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails until he found the one he was looking for. Lydia Morrison contacted me last week. She wanted to meet, said she had information about you that I needed to know. Jane's face went pale. And I told her I wasn't interested in anything she had to say about you or anyone else. I told her that the only person whose opinion I trusted regarding Jane Harris was Jane Harris herself. What did she say? She hung up, but not before informing me that I was making the same mistake I'd made with her, trusting someone who would eventually betray me. Jane searched Stephen's face for any sign of doubt or suspicion. And what did you think when she said that? I thought that the only mistake I'd made was waiting so long to tell the woman I love that she means more to me than my company, my money, or my fears. Jane was quiet for so long that Stephen began to worry he'd misread everything, that his gesture was too little too late. Ask me again, she said finally. Ask you what? If I have a job opening. Stephen felt hope bloom in his chest like spring after an endless winter. Or do you have a job opening, Ms. Harris? I might. The position involves long hours, difficult customers, and a boss who's still learning how to balance work and personal life. Sounds challenging. It is. The pay is terrible. The benefits are non-existent, and you'd have to live above the store in a tiny apartment with questionable plumbing. What are the perks? Jane smiled, and Stephen felt his world shift back into focus. You get to wake up every morning next to someone who loves you. You get to build something meaningful with someone who believes in the same things you do. And you get to prove every day that you're brave enough to choose love over fear. I'll take it. Just like that. Just like that. Jane stood up, moving around the table to where Stephen sat. He pulled her into his lap, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair, the warmth of her skin, the reality of her presence. I have one condition, Jane said against his ear. Name it. No more testing, no more assuming the worst when things go wrong, no more letting other people's opinions override what you know about me. Deal. And no more selling companies without consulting me first. I might have opinions about our financial future, Stephen laughed, the sound rusher and freer than anything he'd felt in months. Deal. Anything else? Just one more thing. What? Jane pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears and joy, and the kind of hope that could build a future worth having. Marry me. Stephen felt his breath catch. What? Marry me, Stephen Green. Not because I work for you or because we have some complicated power dynamic, but because you love me and I love you and we're both tired of being afraid. Jane, is that a yes? Stephen kissed her then, soft and deep and full of all the promises he'd been too scared to make before. When they broke apart, both breathless and laughing, he rested his forehead against hers. That's a yes. That's a hell yes. 1 year later, Stephen stood behind the counter of Harrison Green Books, ringing up a purchase for a customer who'd driven 3 hours from Boston to visit the little bookstore in Vermont that had been featured in Travel and Leisure magazine as a must-visit destination for book lovers and dreamers. "The poetry section is my wife's domain," Stephen said, handing the customer her receipt. "But I can tell you that the Alice Walker collection she recommended is extraordinary." The customer smiled. "Your wife has excellent taste. This place is exactly what I hoped it would be." After the customer left, Stephen looked around the bookstore he and Jane had built together. The original space had been expanded to include a coffee bar, a small performance area for readings and community events, and a children's section that stayed busy with local families. It wasn't the empire he'd once commanded, but it was something better, a business built on community rather than competition, success measured in relationships rather than revenue. "How was the morning rush?" Jane asked, emerging from the back office where she'd been working on inventory. "Steady. 3 tourists, 2 locals, and Mrs. Henderson buying her weekly romance novel. Did you recommend the new Sarah MacLean?" "I recommended you recommend the new Sarah MacLean. I'm still learning the difference between historical and contemporary." Jane laughed, moving into Stephen's arms with the easy intimacy of 2 people who'd learned to trust each other completely. "You're getting better. Last week you only confused Regency with Victorian twice. I'm a work in progress." "We both are." Stephen looked down at his wife, brilliant, brave Jane, who'd had the courage to challenge him, forgive him, and love him into becoming the man he'd never known he could be. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question that had become their evening ritual. "Just one," Jane said, smiling up at him. "What's that?" "I regret that it took us so long to figure out that love isn't about control or protection or keeping safe. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary, especially then." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of their bookstore, illuminating shelves full of stories about love and loss and the courage required to risk everything for the possibility of happiness, Stephen Green held his wife close and marveled at the unexpected turn his life had taken. He'd spent 40 years building walls to protect himself from being hurt, and it had taken 1 spilled cup of coffee and 1 extraordinary woman to teach him that the best things in life happened when you had the courage to tear those walls down. Outside, the mountains of Vermont stretched toward a sky full of possibilities, and inside, 2 people who'd learned to love without fear began planning the next chapter of their story together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.